This podcast is brought to you in association with BSE and its investor awareness initiatives. Investing and saving for retirement may not be top of mind for many in India. After all, it's a young country with a lot of money sloshing around. Plus, the thought of retirement planning can feel intimidating, especially when you are juggling home loans and other expenses. But as Tennessee Williams aptly said, you can be young without money, but you can't be old without it. The big question is, how much do you need to save for retirement? We are about to discuss this and much more in today's episode, which is part of the BSE Investor Week special podcast. I am Nishant Vasudevan, markets editor at the Economic Times and your host for this episode. Joining me today are two experts with clear and actionable advice on retirement planning. First, M. Pattabhiraman, an associate professor of physics at IIT Madras. Mr. Pattabhiraman, also known as Pattu, found his calling in the world of finance and investing. He is the founder of Free FinCal, a platform dedicated to personal finance, mutual funds, and investing. Welcome to the show, Mr. Pattabhiraman.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So, Mr. Pattabhiraman, the first question that everybody has in their mind is that how much money do I need to retire? Is there a simple response to it?
I wish there was, but it is a rather simplistic question because there are so many factors that get into it and so many dynamics. If you do want a thumb rule, because everybody likes those, then I would say to reach the threshold of financial independence, right? You would need at least 30 times your current annual expenses. The corpus should be 30 times your current annual expenses. And that's just the threshold. You're not entered financial independence because it's not just retirement we're talking about. We need to be financially independent at retirement where there's really no need for us to actively work. And we have an income that keeps pace with inflation and maintains our current lifestyle when we start retirement. So that would be 30 times the current annual expenses. But this thing keeps changing because our annual expenses keep changing. We talk about inflation, but the major component in our annual expenses that keeps increasing is because of our lifestyle changes. We opt for bigger cars, better mobiles, etc., and so on. So that's this lifestyle creep that has to be taken into account, and only then you can arrive at a good corpus good estimate of the corpus, I should say, and that will take some time.
Okay, that's great. So, so now that we know about this rule of thumb, what I wanted to understand is that when is the earliest that a person can think about retiring, or when he can plan to retire?
Ideally, it should be from the day you draw your first salary. That would be the ideal retirement planning. And the most important point is just to get into the habit of investing for retirement, no matter what happens to us. Most likely we'll get married, we'll have a couple of kids, we'll have a car loan, we'll have a home loan. These events will change your current expenses. They will change how much you can invest for retirement every month. If you can add something extra from your take-home pay and from the first salary onwards and maintain that as a habit throughout your life, then you're all set for retirement. Of course, you have to invest enough. That's a second part. But this habit of investing for retirement itself should ideally start in your first year of employment, or preferably from the first salary.
So, so if you could explain that to our listeners in terms of numbers. Now, let's say that a person who's just entered the workforce and he's drawing 50,000 rupees a month. How will this math work for him?
So the general thumb rule I have is that if they're spending, let's say 10,000, 15,000 on themselves, initially speaking, as a example, then they should match just that amount for retirement planning. And this is including the EPF for the NPS contribution, including all the employer contribution, etc. And you have an asset allocation of at least 50% equity and 50% fixed income. So that would be a simple thumb rule.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting point, Mr. Pattabhiraman. But actually, the other interesting trend which is catching on among a lot of people in their late 30s and also in their early 40s is the concept of FIRE. Now, FIRE stands for financial independence, retiring early. There are many people who are bored of their jobs, or they probably think that they have made enough in their life to lead a comfortable life even without a regular income. Now, based on what you have seen, sir, uh, and you've also spoken to many of these individuals, how practical is this concept of fire?
I would say the first problem with those aspiring for fire is they're doing it for the wrong reasons. Almost everyone I've talked to about this, they want to just quit their job. They hate their jobs. If you ask them, okay, if that's fine, you hate your job. Let's say you have enough money to retire today, and tomorrow you can, start your fire life or whatever you want to call it. What will you do with your time? They don't have a proper answer, I would say. So I think they should have a proper plan of what they want to do with their time after retirement. And many of them, especially in the fire forums that you see, they have this habit of being overtly risky with their corpus. For one, they assume that this 30x, what I just mentioned in response to your first question, that is enough to start their fire journey. It is not at all enough, because that would entail you're withdrawing too much from your corpus year on year, even if you have reasonable inflation estimates. And if you're going to retire early that with just that much corpus, 30x or thereabouts, then the possibility of outliving your corpus becomes very high, and that's the retirement planner's nightmare. You don't want that. So those are the risks of improper fire planning, I would say. Yes, fire is a good concept, but then you should be very clear about what you want to do with your time. And it's better that it is gainful employment where you are actually spending the time earning a little money and helping others. And of course, you should also be investing enough. So I had mentioned this thumb rule about 100% of your expenses. You can reduce it to 75% or so. 75% to 100% of expenses is for normal retirement. But for somebody who is interested in fire and they want to, so fire, we can define fire as, let's say, anything above retiring above 40 to 50 is fire. And for the normal retirement, it's no longer 60 these days. It's somewhere around, I would say, 50 to 55 is normal retirement for those in corporate sector and so on. So for that 40 to 50 kind of retirement goal, you should be investing twice your expenses. So that's quite a lot more of investing, which means that you will have to be quite frugal with your current lifestyle. So it's not easy. It's a huge thing. And unless there is a calling that you say that, okay, I'm working in a job, but I'm tired of this. I have a calling and I'm going to address that calling. So I want to get out of my current work situation as soon as possible. Then fire is a wonderful idea. It will work. But then that calling should be there.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic piece of advice. Actually, just to pitch in there, there's been a lot of criticism about the expectations, especially the fire related cases, where there is too much of forecasting, aggressive returns forecasting on equities. Now, let's say that there are 2 or 3 bad years. What happens to the overall forecast? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there are two risks with that. One is if you expect a very large return, especially based on what you saw in the last couple of years, many people assume that the rally in the small caps and the rally in the mid caps will always be like that. It will never fall down and they will never correct. But that's not true. We've just seen just a few years before this current rally that we have had 3-4 years of only the large caps moving and the mid and the small caps not moving so much. So that kind of a situation can happen. So we have to be very conservative in the asset allocation mix as well as our return expectations, both before retirement and after retirement. Before retirement, you need that conservative approach because you need to push yourself to invest a little more by applying a conservative return estimate, because that's how the planning goes, right? If you expect less, then to attain your corpus at the desired time, you will have to invest a little more. So it's better to push yourself to do that, because then you have a very good chance of maybe ending up with a slightly higher corpus at the desired time frame. After retirement, a conservative approach is extraordinarily important. Just in the first 5 years of retirement, if there is a poor swing of returns, poor sequence of returns, you will end up depleting your corpus a lot. So after retirement, you have to be extremely conservative in your asset allocation. I would recommend not more than anywhere between 20 to 40% of equity after retirement.
Perfect. Now, the next question is that, let's say, for somebody who's just retired, what are the ideal instruments to park their money? I mean, something where they can balance between, let's say, safety and decent returns.
Which brings us to the newest propaganda by the mutual fund industry, the SWP. Everybody is talking about it. Now, the mutual fund industry has realized that the SIP campaign has worked. Now, everybody knows what an SIP is. So, they want to invest in an SIP. They don't know if that the SIP is just a way of investing. You can't invest in an SIP. And so, they now started, okay, that's done. Let's not spend any more money on that. Let's now start, spend money on SWP, where withdraw every month, which is a kind of a silly thing because both SIP and SWP are unnecessary. The biggest risk of an SWP, especially because that's a build as a post-retirement product. The idea is the industry has understood that there are many of these guys, especially in IT sector, they have multiple crores. They've been working in IT for 20, 25 years. You're going to end up with a couple of houses and a few crores. So, let's capture their market. Let's take all that crores and put it into nice risky funds like aggressive hybrid funds, balanced advantage funds. And let's ask them to do an SWP prompt. So that's a nice commission for those who is peddling it, and also a nice expense, the management fees for the product manufacturer. But that kind of a, approach is extremely dangerous. You need to, as you said, balance between risk and safety in retirement planning. And safety should always be the primary focus, the aspect that you focus on when you retire. So for those who have a slightly larger corpus, let's say it's 45 times annual expenses, 50 times annual expenses, I think they should consider what is called as an income floor. That is, they can buy a pension product, or they can buy a bond from RBI Retail Direct. And this bond can give you biannual interest for the next 30 years to 50 years, depending on what kind of tenure you choose. And this can be held in a joint account, so with you and your spouse. So even after your demise, whenever that can be, your spouse, if he or she survives, they will continue to earn that same interest. So I would say, again, asset allocation matters. It doesn't matter what you had before retirement. It's a very dynamic process. This bucket strategy, people always ask me, it's very open-ended. Can you tell me precisely how much I need to withdraw from this bucket, how much I need to asset allocate among buckets and so on? That is really not possible to foretell now because of how sequence of returns work.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice, Mr. Pattabhiraman. So before we wind up this discussion, what is your advice to our listeners on retirement? Is it just about a lot of money in your bank, or is there more to it?
Oh, there's considerably more to it. First of all, it is about safety, and it is about, I would say, how well you spend your time. The productive use of your time after retirement is very crucial. And for that, you need to plan, which is about, I would say, in the last decade of your retirement, leading up to your retirement, in the last decade of your employment, you should seriously plan for this and implement everything so that you can switch from your regular job to your passion, where you have some way of earning some money from your passion. And also, relationships matter a lot. How you behave with your children today will determine how they take care of you later when you are retired. So it's a mixture of having enough money, having good relationships, and also making productive use of your time in retirement.
That was a real honest piece of heartfelt advice. Thank you, Mr. Pattabhiraman, for joining. It was great having you on the show.
Thank you so much.
Next, we have Ravi Saraugi, co-founder of Samastiti Advisors. Ravi has a deep passion for retirement planning and has co-authored research on the concept of safe withdrawal rates for retirement planning in India. Thank you for joining us, Ravi.
Thanks, Nishant. Pleasure to be here.
So when people talk about retirement, the first question that everybody asks is that how much money do I need to retire? So what is that magical number? How do you arrive at it?
Sure. So, my co-author Rajan Raju and I have devolved quite a bit of time trying to answer this question. So, based on our methodology, we have arrived at certain numbers for different age groups. So, for a typical retiree who's going to retire at the age of 60 and with a life expectancy of 90 years of age, so we are looking at about 30 years spent in retirement. So, whatever this individual is going to spend in their first year of retirement, the retirement corpus should be 33 times that number. And that is a good retirement corpus to last you for the next 30 years.
Yeah, that's interesting. But one key aspect of this the retirement corpus that we are talking about is that it should last long enough. You've done a fair bit of study on that topic. How do you ensure that?
Sure. So, we essentially, when my co-author Rajan Raju and I looked at this issue, we realized that there is a significant amount of research has been directed towards how do you accumulate a retirement corpus. But very few research has happened that once you have accumulated that corpus, how do you withdraw from it in a manner which you will not exhaust it prematurely? What we realized here was that most of these withdrawal calculations were using fixed estimates. What the investor or the planner might do is take a retirement corpus and then assume a constant equity return, assume some constant debt return and inflation, and then estimate how much is an annuity that you can get from your retirement corpus. But this methodology has several problems in that it doesn't account for market volatility. So what we did was we looked at simulations. We took a retirement portfolio, we exposed it to different returns, be it debt returns, equity returns, inflation. And then we arrive at what is a safe withdrawal to do. So our approach yields withdrawal rate in the first year of retirement of about 3.5%.
Let's say that we follow that methodology. How much time will your money last? If you could put that in numbers. Let's say that you start at the age of 61, and then how does it work out?
So this is the 3.5% safe withdrawal rate has been computed for the retirement period of 30 years.
Right. And when you talk about this 30-year time period, are we talking about a lot of exposure to the riskier asset classes? How do you kind of structure a portfolio in that phase, the next 30 years?
So we are looking at broadly a 50% exposure to equity and a 50% exposure to debt. So this is a portfolio which works best because this is a portfolio where the debt part can generate good enough liquidity for meeting living expenses, as well as a part of the portfolio is providing the inflation hedge, and it allows that living expenses to be increased year on year with inflation. Now, when our research was first published, we got a lot of feedback that for some people, the feedback was 50% equity isn't that too much in a retirement portfolio. We think that for retirees who are keeping a disproportionate amount in fixed deposits, they're setting themselves a target, which is too high. They will find it difficult to increase their pension year on year because the real rate on fixed income investments, is broadly 1%. And in certain cases, if we look at fixed income returns on a post-tax basis, they are not very impressive. At the same time, we received a different feedback from a different set of investors who are more aggressive in the risk profile, that why should we keep 50% of the retirement portfolio in fixed income? So we found that both the cases where you take equity exposure very low and the cases where you take the equity exposure very high, both the scenarios show inferior results. So the more volatile your portfolio is, the more it is exposed to the sequence of return risk, which can be very, very problematic for a retirement portfolio. So you need to play a balancing act.
Right, right. Does that also apply to the accumulation stage? Because a lot of the corpus targets that we are talking about, not just for retirement, even general corpus, people are talking about very aggressive exposure to equities. Now, equities as an asset class is volatile. Is there any other way of doing it without going through this entire volatility?
Actually, for the accumulation phase, Nishant, we like a lot of equity. So let's say somebody is in the 30s or 40s planning for retirement in the typical retirement age of 60. Such individuals should heavily make use of equity in the accumulation phase. And that's because they have that runway in front of them where they can compound their money. In fact, for people who are young, even having equity exposure as high at 80 to 90% is preferable, given that it's suitable for the individual's risk profile. Of course, there'll always be individuals who may not be comfortable with this level of equity exposure. And we always tell them that you take it higher, the better, simply because you actually have the luxury of time.
So, Ravi, many people are talking about retiring early these days, as early as their mid 40s, which is obviously popularly known as the FIRE concept, financial independence, retire early. In your experience, how practical or impractical is this concept?
So we are seeing, that this movement has got quite a lot of, fancy of the investors, particularly among the young. In the cases that we have seen, it can be challenging, to retire early simply because the corpus requirements will be large. A broad rule of thumb that you can use is that if you're going to spend 40 years in the retirement, you need 40x expenditure cover. If you're going to spend 50 years in your retirement, you will need 50x expenditure cover. So as you can see, these numbers can be quite large depending on what that individual is currently spending. However, there are cases where we have seen where early retirement has worked for many individuals. I would classify them into three buckets. First is a very, very disciplined saver. Second is cases that we have seen where people have been able to monetize their ESOPs. Many of them have been actually able to hit their financial independence target, much earlier. The third variety, the cases that we have seen is what I would call lucky investors who took accumulation to cryptocurrency, early on. No, not today, but I'm talking about people who actually got into crypto 10 years back and they have, been able to hit their targets. Of course, this is not an investment recommendation to invest in crypto at all. Their situation was very different. They invested in crypto when it was not as well discovered as it is today. So these are the three, categories of investors that we have seen who are able to hit their FIRE targets. But barring these three, it can be a very steep hill for most of us to climb.
Right, right, right. That's great advice. But before we wind up this discussion, I'm sure our listeners would want to know from you what is that one special advice that you always give your clients. Could you share that with us, please?
Yeah, I think one, clear advice to our clients is that, as an investor, as an individual, you have a lot of levers in your hands. So in a lot of cases where, people come to us, can I retire? Can I, get this pension income? When you do the math, you will get a certain output. But when you speak to the individual in terms of what changes they can make in their personal life, the outcome actually, could be very, very different. So I think for most, investors, our, feedback always is that numbers are numbers, but it always makes sense to think about financial planning in a non-financial way as well, and work with somebody to see how you can make things work.
Great, great. Those were great insights, Ravi. Thank you for being a part of the show.
Thanks, Nishant. Nice speaking to you.
That wraps up today's episode. I hope our listeners have gained valuable insights into how much money you need for retirement and the steps required to build that corpus. From this discussion, It's clear that starting early is half the battle, and a consistent approach is key to achieving your goals. Thank you once again, Pattabhiraman and Ravi, for joining us for this conversation. And a big thanks to our listeners for tuning in. This episode was produced by Surohini Jain, sound designed by Rajas Nayak and Amrit Reggie, and executive producers Anirban Chaudhary and Arijit Burman. This is your host Nishant Vasudevan signing off. Have a great week ahead.